Oh, good morning and happy Friday. What even is Friday? What even is time at this point? Does anybody else feel that way right now? Like time doesn't matter anymore? Because tomorrow's the weekend, but what is the weekend when there's nothing? I don't know, guys. Maybe I'm just a little too in my head about this stuff. Anyway, let's talk about the stuff we're talking about today. I'm going to cover some of the illusions in Sula. I'm probably missing some, but I'm trying to hit the key ones here um, and explain a little bit about why I think Morrison includes these illusions. When we get into modern literature, and I guess postmodern literature is really what Morrison is probably a part of. Symbolism and illusions are used less to sort of be like, this clearly represents this. Like, it's not such a clearly, like, it's not like an algebraic thing anymore. And by that, I mean it's no longer like x equals 5. Um, it's often really put there just to sort of like suggest a general feeling or idea. Or I think this is often the case with Morrison's illusions in Sula, it's actually meant to draw some contrast between the thing that is being alluded to and the representation of that thing in the novel. Let me get an example to show you what I mean. So the first big illusion is Shadrach. Shadrach, along with two other biblical figures, I think it's like King Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know. It's one of those long biblical names that nobody knows how to pronounce. um, but um, Shadrach and two other guys. There's the king. The king is like, bow down before me. And the other Shadrach and his friends, being the good believers that they are, like, that's like, we can't bow down to a false prophet. That's like 10 commandment level stuff, dude. We can't do that. And so they refuse to, because their faith in God is stronger than their faith in this king. And because God says you can't, you're not supposed to like worship other people. You only worship God. That's what God says. Um, the king gets angry, throws them into a furnace. But because of their faith, God rewards them and protects them in that furnace. So they're able to walk through the furnace unscathed and come out. And the king is pissed. I don't actually know what happens after that, but that's what happens. Because of their faith, and the point of the story is, because they had faith, they were rewarded for that faith. It allowed them, their faith is what allowed them to walk through that fire unscathed. Their faith in God and their loyalty to God in that moment. Shadrach is sent into a symbolical furnace, World War One, to fight for a country that has treated people who look like him very, very poorly for centuries. To fight for freedom and other ideals that as a black man in America, he doesn't really have full access to, but he still fights. You could maybe connect that to the faith that Shadrach and his companions have in the Bible. Faith that somehow this is the right thing to do, even when the people in charge are not giving you signals that it is. But while Shadrach returns from World War One, that symbolic furnace, physically unscathed, he is deeply suffers deeply in sort of from mental emotional trauma. And I think that is the contrast that Morrison is trying to make there. It is not that, oh yeah, Shadrach, just like the biblical Shadrach, comes out unscathed. He does not come out unscathed. He is deeply injured from a sort of emotional level. And I think that's also sort of meant possibly to draw attention to the way that Black people in America, even after slavery and everything else, were still suffering from tremendous emotional and mental trauma based on the way that they were being treated. Um, so I think Shadrach is also sort of meant to draw attention to that idea too. And the fact that he is sort of like the crazy, belligerent townsperson. There's that quote, and they're like, he's the only person who could curse at white people and get away with it. Um, I think that's meant to kind of say, like, shouldn't everybody who's dealt with what black people had to deal with go crazy? Um, is a thing that I think that Morrison is trying to get us to think about. And I think that's the thing with these illusions. I don't think Morrison is trying to be like, this is this, or this is what you have to think. I think she just wants us to think about that thing as like another layer of our understanding, if that makes any sense. Next up, probably the biggest one, we have Eva in the novel, whose name is very close to the biblical Eve. And I want to talk about some of the connections. Um, Eve in the Bible is obviously she's the first woman, and thus you could sort of think of her as like the matriarch of all mankind. She's the mother of everyone. Um, Similarly, Eva is the matriarch of the peace household. That family, she's the woman in charge. We don't know about any women who come before her. From the perspective of the story, as far as we know, she's the first woman in that family. Obviously, she's not, but I'm just saying from a mythical sort of perspective, we don't get any of her history before her. And I think that's on purpose. Um, some This next one's a little bit of a stretch, but it blurs the line between sort of Eva's role in sort of because Boy Boy leaves her so early, she ends up having to be the parent, both mother and father in some ways. So I think there's some Adam parallels to be made with her as well. God takes one of Adam's ribs to create Eve. Interestingly enough, Eva loses one of her legs to provide for her family. That one might be a stretch, but it's interesting. Um, in the biblical story of the Garden of Eden, um, it is there's the serpent, who is Satan in disguise, approaches Eve and convinces her to eat of the fruit, the forbidden fruit, which is the fruit of the tree of knowledge. Now, in Western culture, that's typically um, shown using an apple. However, there's no reason to think it's an apple, frankly. It's the fruit of the tree of knowledge. It could be any fruit. But when Eve then also convinces Adam to eat the forbidden fruit, God gets pissed because I guess he doesn't like people eating fruit, and he expels them from the Garden of Eden. And all of mankind is cursed from then on in multiple ways. I think one parallel, an interesting parallel, is that Eve calls her oldest son Plum, which is also a fruit that grows on a tree and could just as easily be symbolic of the fruit of the tree of knowledge as an apple. She kills Plum. Um, and she sort of believes after that she's cursed. When Hannah dies, she sort of thinks of herself as being cursed, especially the fact that Hannah dies in fire in the same way she killed Plum. And then I think the other interesting kind of connection there is eventually Sula comes back and expels Eva from the house. Maybe not totally unlike how Adam and Eve were expelled from the Garden of Eden. Again, just some interesting parallels. I'm not saying that Eva is Eve, but I think Morrison wants us to add that to our understanding of things. The rest are not as direct. So Hannah, Sula's mother, there's a biblical Hannah. That Hannah did not have a child for a long time, and it affected her standing in her community. She's married to, I think she was one of two wives of a king or some important person. And in the Bible, in order to sort of like recover her standing in society, she goes and to God, doesn't go to God, but she prays to God and says, please give me a child. If you let me conceive a child, I promise I will make sure that that child spends the rest of his life serving you, God, whatever that means. So she has a child. And she does. She makes good on the promise. She, once that child is of a certain age, she takes and basically gives the child to the church and says, like, like make sure that this child serves God for the rest of his life. That child's name is Saul, at least in the more traditional Hebrew. Also known as Samuel, probably most sort of Christian versions of the Bible, but in the Hebrew version, it would be Saul. Um, I don't know that there's a lot of connections between the biblical Hannah and Hannah Peace, but take that name Saul. Some of you are already there. Take the A, move it to the end. What do you get? Interesting, right? No, I don't think that's an accident, and no, I don't. I don't. I'm not stretching on this one. I think Morrison would have been very aware of that story and very aware of the similarities between the names. So I do think she wants us to think about that on some level. What is the connection that we make? Again, I think it's probably more contrast, right? Hannah is desperate to have a child in the Bible. Hannah in the book doesn't seem like she was desperate for a child. There's that scene where she says, like, I love Sula, but I don't like her. And doesn't seem to be the greatest mom in the world. So I think that's like I think in some ways it might just be to draw some contrast there. And then you've got Saul, who spends the rest of his life devoted to serving God, and Sula, who, again, I don't think is necessarily the opposite there, but it invites a sort of contrast to that biblical character. All right, going on, Chicken Little. So there's a version of the Chicken Little story has I did some research, has existed across different cultures for probably going on 2,500 years, so a very long time. And in most stories, basically, there's a chicken. He's hit on the head by an acorn, and he looks up and he says, "The sky is falling. The sky is falling." And he thinks to himself, "I need to go tell the king that the sky is falling, so we can warn people about this." And so he travels to see the king, and along the way, he meets these other animals, and basically, he like, "The sky is falling." They're like, "What?" And he gets this like mob of people, not people, but animals, who are like, "Oh my God, the sky is falling," because he convinces them all this is true, and they're all on their way to the king to be like, "The sky is falling. This is crazy." And in the most common tellings of this story, before they get to the king, they run across a fox, and the fox is like, "Oh, come on in, come on, come on, come on in. Let me hear what you have to say." Into his den, and then he eats them all. That's the most common story. It's meant to be sort of give a lesson against the idea of like buying into hysteria or buying into paranoia. So I don't know what a way to think about it would be. But like all the people who went and bought toilet paper before this thing happened, everybody was like, "We need toilet paper." And suddenly toilet paper was gone before anything else. Like, I don't know, maybe you needed more food or like medicine, or I don't know. It was weird, right? We all thought it was weird, but so many people bought into that paranoia and that hysteria that they just started buying toilet paper. I'm guilty. I went out and bought a big thing of toilet paper too. I think this story is meant to it is meant to warn us against that kind of group think hysteria. What do we do with that in the story? I don't know. The character Chicken Little is not going around saying the sky is falling or anything, but he is killed by Sula and Nell, to be honest. So they sort of become the Sula, especially, I think, comes maybe sort of like the fox, but I think one person who definitely would not buy into any sort of mass hysteria or paranoia is Sula, because Sula did not give anything about what other people thought, and she would have been the last person to buy into anything like that, I think. So in some ways, she is sort of like the anti-Chicken Little in that way. She's not going to go along with what everybody else wants to do, no matter what they're saying. So that's a connection. There are probably others to be made, but I'll leave those to you. Just a couple quick ones left. And through these last two, we get to two of the only men in the novel who have real names. So if you go back and look at the names of the men, it's an interesting thing to think about. But you've got Boy Boy, for instance, right? Not even a man's name. Plum doesn't really get his own name used. Even Ajax down here is known by Ajax, not Albert. You got the Deweys, you got Tar Baby. You have all these male characters who end up being given these very juvenile names. And I think Morrison is definitely trying to say something about the nature of men. In some way, I think one thing she's trying to say about black men is that they've sort of been emasculated by white culture and history. Like they've lost their ability to become complete men because of what America has done to them, or what really like people in charge, so like white people, have done to them. And so they're sort of left unable to become full men because of the history they carry with them. There's probably books written about that. I could talk about that for a lot longer. But two male characters who do have names, and slightly normal names. We got Jude, who's clearly supposed to be uh, is a reference to Judas Iscariot, who was one of the original disciples of Christ, but who betrays Christ, and which leads to his eventual arrest and his crucifixion. When Judas betrays Christ, I think I'll get this kind of right, and there's probably some biblical scholars out there who will correct me, but one of the ways, like they're in this area, and it was, I don't know the exact biblical. I just know at some point Judas kisses Christ on the cheek, and that's kind of what alerts to people around him that Christ is not doing what he's supposed to be doing. Um, and so he gets arrested. Interestingly, though, Jude is described as kissing Sula on the cheek, actually, like right around where her birthmark is. I'm going to have another video up on Sula's birthmark that'll probably be shorter than this video. You can check out too. Anyway, obviously, Jude betrays Sula, or not betrays Sula, betrays Nell, which is interesting. That puts Nell in sort of an interesting, like Christ-like position. I mean, it asks us for a second, at least, to compare Nell to Christ. Which is just, again, an interesting thing. Do I think that Nell is supposed to like symbolically be Jesus Christ in some way? No. Again, I think instead of like comparing them or saying that these characters are alike, I think mostly what Morrison is asking us to do is to contrast these characters. Lastly, you got Albert, Jax, also known as Ajax. There's a mythical figure who comes up in the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer, who fought in the Trojan Wars, and his name is Ajax. He's thought to be just this, like a really big, beefy dude. Think Jason Momoa, right? That's the dude who plays Aquaman. Just like a big hulking brute but also like probably really good looking kind of guy who's like stronger and braver than almost anybody else. Only Achilles, who's like the hero of those stories, is thought to be stronger and braver than Ajax was. In the end, though, he loses a challenge to Odysseus at one point, and he's so disappointed by it that he takes a sword that Hector, another warrior, had given to him. He slays himself with it, just because he's so disappointed in what he's done. He's killed himself. Now, do I think that Ajax in this book is much like this Ajax? Not really. What do we know about Ajax? He calls Nell and Sula pig meat when they're like teenage girls. When he's first introduced, and I love this passage, but there's a moment where it's like the thing he's most known for is how great he is at swearing. And it's not that he actually uses curse words, but just the way he says the words that he says. Like he's like, everybody's jealous of the way he's able to use those words. So maybe he's like this verbal warrior in the way that the mythical Ajax was a physical warrior. Interesting thing, though, is the way that he is maybe one of the only characters besides Nell that has an actual connection to Sula. Like Sula opens up to him in a way that she hasn't to anybody else except maybe Nell. And one of the things I think we're meant to think of with like the Ajax of myth is this like legendary warrior, perfect man kind of thing. And I think Sula, there's that thing where she's like thinking about digging away at his flesh, thinking she'll find gold. I think Sula builds Ajax in her mind up to be this sort of mythical, like, oh, if she's finally found a man good enough for her. And obviously, this most perfect man ever. And then when she finds out his name is Albert, she's like, oh, you're just a man. So in some ways, I think what we're meant to think here is Sula has built Ajax up into this mythical person, like the mythical Ajax from the story of the Odyssey and the Iliad. Um, and then when she realizes, like looking at his license, like, your name's Albert. I didn't even know your name. There's that piece, she didn't even know his name, but there's also like, and you're just a person. You're not this mythical figure. I think that's when that illusion is sort of broken for her, that she built him up to be more like the mythical Ajax and not just the Albert Jacks of town. Anyway, I wanted to break some of those illusions down for you because I think it could be helpful as you're thinking through your essay ideas. This video was longer than I meant it to be. I'm trying to cut down these, but some people have emailed me and said that they're helpful. I hope they are. I do. I really appreciate those emails when I get them because it gets me out of my negative headspace of being like, you're wasting your time. Nobody's watching these videos. Anyway, hope this is helpful. If you got more questions about these things, let me know. Again, I think the big thing to take away from this, if you write about these illusions in your essay, though, Morrison is not trying to say that Eva is Eve. Shadrach is not Shadrach. Hannah is not Hannah. Ajax is not Ajax. What she's trying to get us to do is to compare and contrast those characters with the mythical and biblical figures that they are allusions to. And I think usually to show us those characters' shortcomings or somebody else's shortcomings, right? For Shadrach, it's not that he has shortcomings, it's that the society in which he lives has some pretty enormous shortcomings. So that's the way to think about that. I hope this is kind of helpful. Thanks for being here. Thanks for being awesome. I'll talk to you guys later.